South Park has done their fair share of multi-part stories over the years, obviously dropping many two-part episodes, but despite their success with three-parters, they've only done a small handful of trilogies. And while stories like Imaginationland or their massive Superhero Saga seem to get a ton of attention from the fanbase, I don't see nearly as many people hyping up Season 17's Black Friday Trilogy. A pseudo-prequel to their hit video game Stick of Truth, the Black Friday Trilogy actually has a lot going for it, poking fun at Game of Thrones, satirizing the consumer culture around Black Friday, and wrapping it in a fun Xbox vs PlayStation console wars package. You could honestly argue there's too much happening in this three-parter, but I think that it's pretty undeniable that they stuck the landing. So join me as I deep dive into South Park's Black Friday Trilogy just in time for Black Friday. Wait, what did you say? They're gonna do what?
In an effort to make sure everyone is prepared, the mall has decided to push Black Friday by 1 week.
Okay, so like, just in time for the beginning of December, I guess. Let's get into it. Hey, this video is brought to you by two things today. One is my official compilation channel, Johnny Too Cozy, where I'm re-editing tons of my old videos into themed compilations, long videos that are great for sleeping or drawing. And second, my wonderful patrons who get tons of extra content exclusive to Patreon. We're currently in the middle of season 2 of our BoJack Horseman audio commentaries. Check those out if they interest you. Thank you so much for your support. I couldn't do it without viewers like you. So, as I mentioned in the intro, South Park's Black Friday Trilogy was primarily made up of three major story factors. It's clearly meant to parody and make fun of Game of Thrones, which had just aired its third season in the summer of the same year. They've turned the idea of console wars into an actual war using the aforementioned Game of Thrones parody, and of course the social commentary surrounding Black Friday and consumer culture. But interestingly, the initial jumping off point also included another major factor. With Season 17 leading up to the release of their massive RPG South Park The Stick of Truth, Stone and Parker talked about how many of the ideas for the game fell to the wayside.
Originally, it started as a thing of like, there was just so many things that we wanted in the video game that ended up having to get lifted out of the game that were like, God, this is all such funny, cool stuff.
This is why so many of the kids are wearing the same outfits and gear that they wore in Stick of Truth. Cartman, Kenny, Stan, Butters, Jimmy, all wearing the exact same stuff from the RPG. Though obviously Cartman's wizard outfit was actually first utilized in Season 6's The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, and I expect that they changed Kyle's gear and outfit from Stick of Truth because in that game he's portrayed as a king, whereas he's not the leader in this story.
We actually ended up using really nothing that was thrown out from the video game because this just became its own, totally its own idea.
I think there are more places where some of the ideas from the games were going to be baked into the story as well, but were pulled out at the very last minute in some cases, but we'll go over those as we get there in the story. Also, similarly to some of their other trilogies, they didn't start it with the intention of it being a trilogy. Often these kinds of bigger stories just sort of expand as they write, and while this one landed at 3 episodes, they even briefly thought about going bigger.
We didn't know, are we going to do this 2 parts? Are we going to do 3? Are we going to do 4? We even talked about just doing the whole rest of the season with this idea. We probably could have, because it just branched off into so many different things.
And with how much this story is juggling, I sort of agree with them here. What we ended up with is super satisfying, but they probably could have used one more episode, bringing them to the end of Season 17. But I also think these episodes don't get enough credit for how ingeniously all of these ideas do mesh together. At a glance, it all feels really disparate, but when you really dissect the different story elements, it actually works so well. Matt and Trey have these great fantasy character models from Stick of Truth, so perfect. Let's use those for a big epic fantasy making fun of Game of Thrones. That tracks. But how does that tie into Black Friday?
It was really once we had the idea of like, let's center this all around Black Friday, because that's this sort of epic thing that the whole town can be dealing with. That's when we knew we kind of had a big idea.
Yeah, Black Friday sounds like something out of Game of Thrones. I mean, it sounds like some foreboding thing.
So in Black Friday, Matt and Trey have found their red wedding, but then comes the all-important question for the best of South Park's stories. What is at stake for the kids? What child-centric motivation is brought to the table that starts simply, but ends up pulling the boys deeper and deeper into something big and ridiculous? And the answer is, of course, video games. This episode came out right before the PS4 and Xbox Ones were set to launch at retailers, and so Matt and Trey dusted off the age age-old console wars and turned it into the actual war in which their Black Friday Game of Thrones event took place. And this was also able to ingeniously tie into their social commentary regarding Black Friday, namely that it is incredibly sad and embarrassing how aggressive and violent people will get to save a few bucks on a flat screen TV. It really is all just so well tied together. Each and every aspect of the story has a natural Venn diagram crossover with another part of the story. So while yes, these episodes are doing a lot with this story, I truly think the aspects they chose to tie together are done so ingeniously. But let's get into the episodes themselves.
They are calling it Black Friday. Woo, spooky!
This trilogy starts with a lineup of mall security guards, including Randy, and lays out the exact issue that would cause the incoming conflict.
The mall is offering 80% off to the first 30 people in the store.
So right off the bat, they're laying in their criticisms towards the way these Black Friday events take advantage of your average consumer at the expense of their well-being, and lays in the obvious Game of Thrones influence.
Winter is coming.
I really don't think this trilogy gets quite enough credit for how epic and grand they make it feel. Even just this little camera move and the big fantasy music set to Cartman walking to Kenny's house goes such a long way to make it feel like a big event. The score in particular really sells the scale. But as I mentioned earlier, as is the case in so many of my favorite South Park episodes, the stakes are smaller and kid-centric, and so Cartman gathers everyone together to lay out his plan.
We have fought many great battles together. At Cloud's house, at Scott Malkinson's house.
This is such a small line, but it's honestly one of my favorites in the entire trilogy. A, it's incredibly funny, but B, it so perfectly represents that kid point of view. How the games they play feel so much bigger to them than just games, to the point where he's reminiscing about the battle at Scott Malkinson's house. These are the kinds of little details that showcase that kid perspective that makes these stories so much fun for me. This is also one of the things that Stick of Truth does perfectly. And fittingly, Cartman's entire gathering is just about the boys getting next-gen video game consoles. He's caught wind of the Black Friday deal, and his plan is for everyone to work together so they can all get that deal.
We can be the first people inside on Black Friday, and use the 80% to get the gaming systems we need to survive.
But the Game of Thrones influence takes more hold here, as well as the implementation of their version of the console wars. During the big meeting, Cartman pointedly says next-gen gaming consoles, without specifying which one, but later specifies Xbox One. So when the fighters of Zoran realize they aren't on the same side of the console wars, the infighting begins.
I thought we were getting PlayStation 4s. What?
Obviously, console wars are nearly as old as video game consoles themselves. SNES vs Genesis, N64 vs PlayStation, PS2 vs GameCube vs Xbox, the cycle renews each generation. I can't express how much I love the fact that they decided to portray this gen's console wars in this melodramatic, soap operatic Game of Thrones influenced story. The way the boys argue so emotionally over video game features is such a funny way to portray the ongoing fandom war. And of course, South Park is always good at throwing in personal stakes, pitting old friends against each other.
Stan, the PS4 doesn't have the seamless transition between games, movies, and TV offered by Xbox One. The PS4 controller has a touchpad interface.
Obviously, the personal stakes make this more emotional, but the way the characters make statements about each other's fandoms like this is such an accurate representation of how these silly console wars have been argued on gaming forums for years.
Come on, Cap. Let these Sony wallow in their limited voice control functionality.
In addition to the Game of Thrones influence on the story here, they also start to layer in some of their own criticisms of Game of Thrones as a show. And honestly, this was early Game of Thrones, after season 3, so as fans, Matt and Trey were getting pretty fed up even before most of the rest of the fandom turned on the show in its final seasons.
And then getting to season 3 and going, okay, well the dragons are still coming and the zombies are still coming.
So in this initial episode, they mostly echo their frustrations with the show through Butters, who is watching it for the first time.
I'm still waiting for the darn dragons to show up and kick everyone's butts. But all I get is wiener, wiener, wiener.
Honestly, the first episode really does throw a lot of balls in the air, and there was no guarantee that they would manage to juggle them all. It had a lot of ideas. Randy's whole subplot is that he's got his own ulterior motives for joining the mall security guards, which Sharon clocks immediately.
You're doing this to try and get to the front of the line on Black Friday, aren't you?
The Black Friday situation gets worse when they introduce a new Elmo doll.
Stop touching me, Elmo.
This is actually a reference to the real-life allegations against Elmo's puppeteer, Kevin Clash. Cartman and Stan each desperately try to recruit more people to their sides, with Cartman having far more success. That is, until Sony actually gets involved.
The Black Friday Bandudu. which will include 4 controllers, a map of Japan, a $100 rebate.
So yeah, as you can see, this first episode just does so much. It throws countless ideas, references, pieces of commentary, and storylines all into the air with the intention that over the next episode or two, they'll be able to juggle them all. It's a lot of great setup with no real promise that they'll be able to stick the landing. And it even ends on one of my favorite cliffhangers in South Park history, the reveal that shifts the power dynamics significantly.
All hail the princess!
So Kenny has switched sides, the tides of war have turned. But the second episode of the trilogy, A Song of Ass and Fire, evolved a ton over the course of its production week. So before we get into what it became, please allow me this fun but relevant tangent about what the episode almost was, and it's all about Stick of Truth cut content.
And it was really going to be this episode that was just about going around and getting factions to join. And so it was like Kenny went and recruited Underpants Gnomes, so Cartman went and recruited Crab People, and it didn't feel super Game of Thrones because that's not what it is.
So this is definitely some of the stuff they mentioned earlier in the commentary that was initially them trying to implement cut storylines from Stick of Truth into the show. Thanks to some early builds of Stick of Truth, as well as some concept art, we know for a fact that there were going to be entire quests involving a Crab People / Underpants Gnome feud. Obviously, Underpants Gnomes still appeared in Stick of Truth, as well as a single crab person, but there was meant to be an entire underground section of the game where you not only visit the Crab People city, but the Underpants Gnomes mines also. You can see the concept art for this shared underground area here, and if you even look at the first E3 trailer for Stick of Truth, we see Crab People in the giant battle, as well as an individual fight between your character and Crab People here. And there's lots of videos available online attempting to showcase as much of the cut content as possible. Shout out to the channel Roaming Berry for these. Highly recommend checking that channel out. So this definitely tracks as some of these cut stories from Stick of Truth that Matt and Trey mentioned earlier. The pair even confirmed that this stuff nearly made it into the show.
We still had, actually on Tuesday, we still had Kenny going and recruiting Underpants Gnomes, and it just wasn't feeling right.
There's actually a deleted scene of this on the Season 17 Blu-ray. The boys bring the gnomes some underpants to earn their favor and gain their support.
Then you will fight with us on Black Friday?
Who wants to go to the mall on Black Friday and try to get PlayStations?
I think ultimately they made the right decision to abandon the Underpants Gnomes and Crab People angle for this trilogy. As much as I love when they loop in the show's lore and history into bigger stories, it doesn't quite mesh with the story they told here.
Sometimes getting factions and building your armies is just watching people go shopping.
Yeah.
By adding to their army, isn't that fun?
It also really does feel like something that would have been better in the video game. I adore Stick of Truth, but I would pay an ungodly amount of money to see their original vision for it brought to life. There's a ridiculous amount of cut content. Honestly, I should probably make a dedicated video about it at some point. There's actually one other deleted scene as well, which suggests that they abandoned another potential direction for this story, where Kyle maybe jumped ship and joined Stan and Kenny. It's just a funny, quick little scene where Stan and co are showing Kyle how great the PS4 is at a game store.
Whoa, it vibrated on both sides. Yeah, dude, that's DualShock. Is that a speaker on the controller? Yep. Dude, that's pretty cool.
With the nature of South Park's production schedule, it's always interesting to see how these different things could have turned out had they gone with one idea over another. But what they did end up going with really makes this entire trilogy so cohesive. They lean really far into Microsoft and Sony getting heavily involved in the console wars themselves, which firstly lends to the bigger scale of the Game of Thrones aspect of the story, especially seeing Bill Gates fully take out Steve Ballmer. But it also perfectly aligns with the episode's commentary on Black Friday consumerism and how these corporations take advantage of everyday folks by pitting them against each other to gain leverage in news media.
So we've come to offer swords and battle axes, whatever the kids can carry to help them fight their way through the other shoppers.
But personally, my favorite angle they took with this second episode is the personal angle. The most important aspects of these stories are always the characters and their emotions, and that big ending reveal from the first episode was exactly the circumstance they needed to explore.
We had to get into the emotion of Cartman being super pissed off at Kenny and being betrayed.
I like that the issue here primarily stems from Cartman's own ego, preventing his friend from playing the game the way he wants to. Cartman says he's fine with Kenny being a girl in the game, but the fact that he's a wizard king means he will not let Kenny be a royal princess.
That goddamn traitor. You know why Kenny's doing this, right? because he wanted to be a princess and I wouldn't let him.
Honestly, one of my favorite moments in this trilogy is right here, when Cartman sees the photo of him and Kenny at Casa Bonita and slams it face down on his table. Genuinely one of Cartman's most human moments in the entire show. Though one of the funniest through lines across all of these episodes is absolutely the Betrayal Garden. Cartman basically brings various allies there and gives them the same spiel over and over, that nobody else matters as long as they get their Xboxes.
The rest are simply there to help us get through those doors.
Don't believe it! He said that to a bunch of people!
Okay, maybe this dude who's pissed that Cartman keeps using his garden is the actual funniest part. This is just such a great runner, particularly when the script gets flipped on Cartman with Bill Gates, who takes the power position over Eric.
The rest are simply there to help us get through those doors.
What?
Ha ha! Now who's walking who through the Betrayal Garden?
This episode might be the funniest of the three. They even loop in George R.R. Martin, who promises Butters and Scott Malkinson that he has ordered pizzas, but instead just keeps describing Game of Thrones wieners.
Okay, fine. What kind of pizzas do you want?
What kind do we want? He hasn't even ordered the pizzas yet.
This is obviously a gag playing on Matt and Trey's frustrations that the dragons and zombies were definitely coming in Game of Thrones, but they hadn't yet, at the time at least. The second episode of this trilogy actually aired the week before Black Friday, which we know is the same week as Thanksgiving, which I think makes this big ending beat even funnier, where they push back Black Friday an entire week.
The genius idea was proposed by George R.R. Martin.
This was forecasting that Matt and Trey would not be producing an episode the week of Thanksgiving, which is always the case in the fall for them, and that the big Black Friday finale would actually be taking place after Black Friday. Interestingly, right at the end of this episode, Matt and Trey actually decided to pull something directly from Stick of Truth and put it in the show, and Stick of Truth hadn't even come out at this point.
Wow, Kenny's a Japanese princess.
This whole Princess Kenny anime intro sequence is right from the final battle of Stick of Truth, but Matt and Trey decided to lean into it a good 4 months before the game released and use it as a major plot point for these final 2 episodes. I do think it's a little strange since this is part of the final sequence of Stick of Truth that they decided to spoil it this far ahead, but it does fit really well, it is really funny, and they also admit that they almost moved a whole different direction with Princess Kenny at the end of this episode.
Luckily, we almost ended this show with him turning into the Japanese prison and then going and having these like superpowers and being able to like blow armies away and all that stuff. And it wasn't until we started episode 3 that we're like, oh no, he shouldn't have any powers, he's just cute.
It's funny how many of these last minute decisions could have completely changed the trajectory of this entire trilogy, but because they didn't, they were really able to lean into the whole cute anime princess angle, especially in this final episode where he basically just saves the day with his cuteness.
He flew down in a parachute and he what? Apparently he stopped Microsoft from blockading the shipment of PS4s to the mall. Looks like he's all over the place winning the console wars for Sony.
While this is very funny, if I had to criticize anything about these 3 episodes, I'd say that the anime Kenny sequences could have maybe used a bit more action and actual examples of Kenny using his cuteness, you know, like out in the field. The parachute blockade thing is great, but I think that's kind of where it peaked. This is a small nitpick though, because in basically every other way, they absolutely nail the finale. They fully lean into every single thing that they set up to this point. My biggest laugh of the episode is definitely Cartman getting fed up with Bill Gates here.
Tell Bill Gates to suck my ass, Mom! Mom? Don't seriously tell Bill Gates to suck my ass. Tell him everything's cool and I'll come in a little bit.
And in Game of Thrones fashion, this final episode has it all. False alliances, betrayal, a Red Robin wedding. Though more in South Park fashion, they have a really raw and emotional confrontation between Stan and Kyle, where Kyle realizes that he trusted Cartman over his actual best friend.
But you couldn't just ask me. Because Xbox people don't care about the truth. They just care about seamless multimedia connectivity.
And also in South Park fashion, some pretty explicit criticism of the Black Friday culture they've been parodying. When the mall finally opens, alongside all the animated violence, they intercut actual real-life footage of Black Friday stampedes.
News talks about like, okay, it's Black Friday today, you know, we have no reports of casualties, and you're just like, what is this, a fucking tornado or a war, or what are they talking about? And they're talking about shopping?
In the end, I think Stan had the right idea here. He tries to unite his friends, recognize realizing that the only people who profit from their feud are these corporations that they've pledged their allegiance to, and instead of fighting his friends, he gets the head of these corporations to duke it out. Honestly, the end of this episode contains a sequence that is easily one of my favorite in South Park history. After watching Bill Gates literally murder the competition in front of them, the children all somberly walk through the carnage of Black Friday as sad piano renditions of Christmas tunes play in the background. And then they buy their Xboxes. I can't think of a more perfect sequence that is not only emotionally impactful, but so beautifully illustrates the crossroads of all of these insane, disparate story elements that they've seamlessly woven together in this narrative. It's excellent stuff.
Black Friday is over. There's been death, violence, horrible human behavior, and the big winner here, decidedly, is Channel 9 News.
And I particularly love the message at the end. As all of the boys sit and play Xbox, it's clear that they aren't fulfilled. That winning the console wars and getting the best Black Friday deal wasn't worth the bloodshed that came with it.
You guys want to play outside or something?
And sure, this is ultimately also a slightly self-serving advertisement for their video game, but one of the things that South Park has always done best is showcase a kid's imagination at work. That's one of the reasons these episodes work so well, despite how off the rails they eventually flew. And so for the kids' ultimate lesson here, to be for them to embrace the imagination that got them there, I think is pretty great. Particularly because that's also what the Stick of Truth video game showcases so well in the same world through these same characters.
Like this. We can just play with this. Screw video games, dude. Who f***ing needs them? Yeah!
In the end, I think I myself may have even underappreciated this trilogy over the years. When you really look at it, it is a genuinely perfect intersection of everything South Park does well. Biting cultural and social commentary, fun pop cultural referencing and lambasting, all through the lens of a bunch of kids who just want to do kid stuff. South Park's most underrated trilogy for sure.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.